Hey team, this is a piece titled The Marxism of the Second International by Lucio Colletti. Let's get started. The very notion of, quote, Marxism of the Second International is a loose one, which requires precise definition. It will be used here in a limited sense, i.e. as the Marxism of the two major Marxist theoreticians of the period, Kautsky and Plekhanov. This, quote, practical definition should not be taken to mean that the Marxism of the Second International is a self-contained phenomenon clearly defined with respect to the First International and to what followed. Actually, much of the Marxism of the Second International can be found in Engels' last work, Ludwig Feuerbach, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, and the 1895, quote, introduction to the new edition of Class Struggles in France. Similarly, a considerable amount of the Marxism of the Second International was inherited by the Marxism of the Third International, e.g., the characterization of Marxist philosophy as, quote, dialectical materialism. In addition to Engels' last writings, this characterization is very relevant to Plekhanov's philosophical work and was also substantially accepted later in the period of the Third International. Despite all that has been said, the philosophical continuity between Plekhanov and Lenin is much stronger than it seems. The same can be said of both Bukharin and Trotsky. The so-called, quote, revisionism complements the Marxism of the Second International not because, quote, orthodox and, quote, revisionist Marxism are the same thing or because we wish to overstress the final reconciliation between Kautsky and Bernstein or Plekhanov's attitude towards the October Revolution. Rather, since, quote, revisionism was at least partly conditioned by the peculiarities of the Marxism of the period, it can be seen as complementary to the Marxism of the Second International. In any discussion of this phenomenon, it is necessary to mention Austrian Marxism, Max Adler, Otto Bauer, Rudolf Hilferding, Karl Brenner. In fact, Karl Kautsky himself can be said to belong to this grouping. Obviously, this trend has its own peculiarities, particularly in philosophy. At any rate, especially because of Kautsky, Hilferding, and Bauer, Austrian Marxism can also be considered a component of the Marxism of the Second International. What follows is an attempt to illustrate some attitudes of the Marxism of the Second International concerning specific problems by reference to writings which can be considered typical. Causality and teleology. Teleology, or final cause, is a process whose origin is an idea which is not an object but a concept with respect to which the object is posed as a goal or point of arrival. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant says that, quote, the goal is the object of a concept to the extent that the concept is considered to be the cause of the goal, the real foundation of its possibility, and the causality of a concept in relation to its object is the teleology forma finalis, end quote, Immanuel Kant. Thus, teleology inverts the order of causality proper, real or efficient causality, in the sense that, whereas in terms of the real causality, we say that the cause precedes the effect and determines the effect, this effect is an end, i.e., an intentional goal, then it is itself what determines the real cause, which becomes a simple means at the goal's service. The importance of teleology as the overturning of causality is asserted in the theses on Feuerbach, in which Marx speaks of Weltende, or revolutionäre praxis. It is also asserted in the definition of human laboring activity, or more simply of labor, contained in the 5th chapter of the 1st volume of Capital. It is in that famous passage in which Marx talks about the difference between the architect and the bee, quote, at the end of the working process, there emerges a result that was already present at the beginning in the idea of the worker, which as such was already ideally present, end quote. As Marx explains in the working process, the worker, quote, realizes in the natural element its own goal, end quote. In historical materialism, causality is as essential as teleology, but causality being as essential as teleology does not mean that teleology has priority over causality. Work itself, according to Marx, is both teleology and causality. Yet it is impossible to exclude teleology. Without teleology, in fact, it is impossible to explain human activity and human activity's ability to transform the world. A conception that excludes teleology, or which fails to explain it properly, cannot explain the importance of subjective human interaction and of consciousness in history. It is interesting to note Kautsky's and Plekhanov's attitudes towards this problem. Plekhanov's position can be reconstructed by beginning from his passage repeated 1,000 times, according to which, quote, freedom is the, quote, recognition of necessity, end quote. This is essentially a Hegelian position, overlooking what Hegel meant by freedom being recognition of necessity. Let us consider what Plekhanov meant. Assuming that by, quote, necessity, Plekhanov means the functioning of objective laws operating in history independently of human consciousness, for Plekhanov, quote, freedom reduces to the consciousness of these laws operating in history independently of human consciousness, or better yet, to these objective laws in history functioning independently of human consciousness, which is recognition. Afterwards, men regulate their actions by these laws operating in history independently of human consciousness. In outlining this relationship between, quote, freedom and, quote, necessity and teleology and causality, Plekhanov appeals to Schelling's system of transcendental idealism as well as to Hegel. Plekhanov's entire philosophy culminates with the thesis that Marxism is a form of Spinoza's philosophy. In this conception, however, there is obviously no room for an explanation of the historical role and function of subjective human intervention. The, quote, reversal, end quote, typical of human praxis, which is injected into praxis by the fact that teleology, i.e. reversed causality, is present in it, cannot find an adequate explanation here. It is important to emphasize this point since the positivistic foundations of Plekhanov's Marxism helped generate a very important problem during the entire period of the Second International. The problem of the function of personality in history. In fact, a famous work by Plekhanov bears precisely this title. But it is evident that Plekhanov cannot satisfactorily solve this problem, and his position is unable to mediate teleology and causality, objective conditions, and human subjective intervention. Kautsky's Marxism has similar defect. Whereas Plekhanov sees Marxism through Spinoza, Kautsky sees Marxism through Darwin. The work that we have in mind is ethics and the materialist conception of history. Just as a side note, I don't really know I don't know if it's correct, and I don't know if it's true or what the meaning of it is, but I have heard that Kautsky was a pretty serious scholar of pretty serious, not scholar, better word would be student, a pretty serious student of Darwin before he was ever a student of Marx or Marxism, to the extent that Marxism existed before Kautsky. Some people say it doesn't. Kautsky's inability to make room for teleology in his frame of reference is shown by Kautsky's reduction of ethical problems to instincts. Kautsky calls, quote, morality an instinct, ein tierischer Trieb. I believe that was also, what's that called? Can't remember what it's called. But it's basically something that you find in a lot of the empiricist people, and I think so for example, David Hume, I think his whole thing was morality doesn't stem from universal principles, but certain kind of gut level fellow feeling. But then the question of that is what if those instincts aren't there? Does that make and then that's a whole question, The moral problem implies responsibility and choice. Obviously, there can be no responsibility and choice where everything is regulated by instincts. There we are. See, that's the thought. That's what I'm saying. It is important to emphasize these limitations in Kautsky's and Plekhanov's conceptions, since doing so makes it possible to explain how, given this kind of Marxism, a neo-Kantian reaction like Bernstein's and Schmidt's revisionism was almost inevitable. To verify this point, one need only examine a review of Kautsky's book on ethics written by Otto Bauer, also a neo-Kantian, in Neue Zeit. On the other hand, as Lucien Goldman has indicated in his article, I don't know how to say that, YATA-T-ILUNE, Sociologie Marxiste, Kautsky's own book ends contradictorily with a Kantian act of faith. The inability to mediate between teleology and causality is more or less typical of the Marxism of the Second International. Kautsky and Plekhanov simply liquidated teleology in favor of causality, thus the strong deterministic emphasis in their Marxism. In Austrian Marxism, teleology is instead recognized and has a place, but rather than having the mediation and composition of the two processes, labor, according to Marx, is both causality and teleology. A kind of dualism results. The two processes are articulated in a parallel way, but they never meet. Without going back to Max Adler's Kausalität und Teleologie, one can see this in the quote preface to Hilferding's Finanzkapital, in which the contraposition of causality and teleology reappears as the antithesis of quote value judgments and quote judgments of fact of science and ideology. Science quote observes. Science can suggest no option for human action. There's a radical opposition between the objective, impartial scientific judgment of facts and the teleology of value. From scientific premises, it is impossible to draw imperative, binding conclusions for action. Hilferding wrote, quote, "It is said that politics is a normative science based in the ultimate analysis on value judgments extraneous to science, so that political analysis would keep us out of scientific investigation. It is obviously impossible to deal here with the much debated theoretical speculative questions concerning the relations between doctrines of norms and doctrines of laws, between theology and causality. It suffices to say that for Marxism, even the goal of political analysis can consist solely of the discovery of causal connections. According to the Marxist conception, the task of a scientific politics consists in the discovery of the factors that determine the will of the classes, i.e., causal connections. Along with the theory, the politics of Marxism are also free of, quote, value judgments, end quote. End quote. Further on, Hilferding concludes, quote, "It is therefore a mistaken conception, even if diffused inter e extramuros, to unqualifiedly identify Marxism and socialism. Logically considered, i.e., seen solely as a scientific system, and overlooking its historical efficacy, Marxism is only a theory of the laws of social becoming, ... To recognize the validity of Marxism, which implies the recognition of the necessity of socialism, does not at all mean to formulate evaluations or to indicate a line of practical conduct, since it is one thing to recognize a necessity and another to place oneself at the service of the necessity," end quote. Here the separation between science and revolution, knowledge and the transformation of the world is complete. This separation typifies the Marxism of the Second International, divided as it was between positivistic scientism and neo-Kantianism. Deterministic objectivism fails to include the ideological moment and the revolutionary political program. On the other hand, excluded from science, ideology reappears as the world of, quote, ethical freedom, side by side with the world of natural, quote, necessity, thus reproducing the Kantian dualism between müssen and sollen. The concept of social relations of production. The best definition of the concept of, quote, social relations of production, end quote, can be found in Wage, Labor, and Capital. Marx wrote, quote, in production, men not only act upon nature, but also upon one another. Men produce only to the extent that men collaborate in a determinate way and reciprocally exchange their own activities. In order to produce, men enter in determinate ties and relations, and men's action upon nature, production, takes place only within the frame of reference of these ties and social relations, end quote. Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital. As can be seen from this definition, the concept of, quote, social relations of production, end quote, contains two fundamental relations: the relation man-nature, production, and the interhuman relation, the social relation. There is no relation of man with nature without the relation of man with man, and vice versa. These two reciprocally inseparable relations designate 1, a relation in which nature is the cause and man the effect, and 2, a relation in which man is the cause and nature the effect. Both these relations constitute labor, the working or productive process. The first relation expresses the aspect whereby labor is the adaptation of man to the quality and nature of the objects worked upon. Quote, in order to command nature, end quote, Bacon used to say, quote, one must obey nature, end quote. The second expresses the aspect whereby labor is the adaptation of the domain of needs to man. This last element is also expressed by the fact that the product of labor is the realization, the objectification of the idea, for which the worker has undertaken the labor. Recall Marx's already quoted passage concerning the difference between the labor of the bee and the architect. In other words, the concept of, quote, social relations of production, end quote, leads us back to the connection between causality and teleology. The inability of the Marxism of the Second International to conceive of these two processes together also entails the inability to grasp the decisive Marxist concept of social relations of production. This leads to a radical impoverishment of other connected concepts such as, quote, production, quote, economy, and even, quote, economic structure. The economy is considered a purely material sphere which does not contain interhuman relations. That's extremely important right there. I'm going to repeat that again. The economy is considered a purely material sphere which does not contain interhuman relations. Quote, production is considered a simple, quote, productive technique, end quote, independent of determinate social relations. There is often a tendency to substitute the concepts of, quote, structure and, quote, superstructure for, quote, social relations of production. This facilitates the introduction of two superimposed planes, a, quote, material base below and a, quote, ideological superstructure, end quote, above. The difficulty in connecting these two levels, the first being purely material and the second purely spiritual, is analogous to the problems encountered in pre-Kantian metaphysics, e.g. in Descartes. Several consequences follow. First, to connect the two levels, a series of intermediate planes are created. In Fundamental Questions of Marxism, Plekhanov gives the following list. Quote, 1. The state of the forces of production. 2. The economic relations conditioned by these forces. 3. The socio-political regime built upon a given economic, quote, base. 4. The psychology of social man partly determined directly by the economy and in part by the whole socio-political regime built upon the economy. And 5. The different ideologies reflecting such a psychology, end quote. Plekhanov. Secondly, the unity of economy and sociology in Marx's work is lost. It can no longer be understood that in Marx economic categories are also socio-historic agencies. The economic categories are also social classes, as Schumpeter's essay on Marx points out very clearly. Thirdly, the concepts of, quote, economy and, quote, productive sphere tend to lose all social content and becoming purely, quote, technical concepts. This occurs not only in Kautsky and Plekhanov, but also in Bernstein. There is an interesting letter written to Kautsky by Engels dated June 26, 1884, regarding anti-Rodbertus. Engels writes, quote, as soon as you mention means of production, you also mean society, and a society simultaneously codeterminate, mitbestimmte, by these means of production. In the same way that there are no means of production by themselves outside of society, and without the influence of society, there is no capital in itself, end quote. The evaluation of Hegel. In the perspective of the Marxist tradition of Hegel studies, Plekhanov's essay, Zu Hegels sechster Todestag, published in 1891 in Neue Zeit, deserves special attention. The essay was written in the style of Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, which had been published 3 years earlier in the same journal. Attempting to complete the picture, Plekhanov extended the discussion to Hegel's philosophy of history. Plekhanov's reading of the lectures on the philosophy of history develops a few themes that can be easily summarized. For Plekhanov, Hegel's importance for the, quote, science of society consists primarily in the fact that he investigates the phenomenon of this science from the point of view of becoming, i.e., of their arising and passing away. The historical conception, which before Hegel hinged on the, quote, antithesis, truth, error, end quote, has undergone a radical transformation. Truth and error and rational and irrational have become dialectical moments of the historical process. Since in the course of this process, philosophical systems as real institutions reveal themselves as the expression of their own epochs, error itself ceases to appear an accidental and fortuitous element, and instead reveals its internal necessity and rationality. Plekhanov's argument repeats and confirms the judgment expressed 3 years earlier by Engels. The greatness of Hegel's philosophy is that Hegel's philosophy is a philosophy of becoming. Quote, in the course of evolution, all that before had been real becomes unreal. It loses its necessity, its right to exist, its rationality. The dying reality gives way to a new vital reality, end quote. And continues Engels, quote, the thesis that everything real is rational is a result of the rules of Hegelian thinking and generates its opposite. All that exists must perish, end quote. Engels. In addition to this theme, Plekhanov elaborates a second one which emphasizes those parts of the, quote, introduction to the philosophy of history published separately as Reason in History, in which Hegel discusses how philosophy, law, art, religion, and technology in each epoch are in the utmost reciprocal relationship and form a block or a vital organism. As is well known, the references to those pages of the Vorlesungen, better developed in Lasson's edition than in the one available to Plekhanov, which had been published immediately after Hegel's death, which contains an elaboration of the relationship between the state and religion, and more broadly of that among the various, quote, spheres of the life of the people, end quote. Quote, when we talk about a people, end quote, writes Hegel, quote, we must indicate the forces in which its spirit is particularized. These particular forces are religion, constitution, the legal system, including the civil code, industry, art, science, etc., end quote. Hegel continues, quote, what is of interest to our universal consideration is the connection between these distinct moments. All the aspects manifested in the history of a people are reciprocally connected by the closest ties, end quote. Most people consider this unitary connection to be a simple interaction, Wechselwirkung, and forget that there must be a common source which gives rise to all these aspects into this life sphere. According to Plekhanov, Hegel's great merit is to have criticized the viewpoint that remains content with simple interaction, and thus to have asserted the need to consider the two aspects of the interaction as the aspect and the product of a, quote, third, quote, transcendental element, i.e., the units, superimposed upon them. According to Plekhanov, quote, in relation to the various aspects of a country's public life, we must never stop with the indication of reciprocal actions and interactions. Rather, we must attempt to explain these interactions in terms of, and beginning with a, quote, third, or, quote, higher element, i.e., with what conditions their very existence and, consequently, the possibility of their interaction, end quote. Plekhanov. In Hegel's case, this, quote, third and, quote, element is the national spirit, Volksgeist, which from time to time embodies the universal spirit, Logos, whose realization and fulfillment is all of history. Granting what is no longer a discovery today, i.e. that Hegel's concept of history is, quote, permeated throughout by the purest idealism, end quote, and that this, quote, idealistic foundation is its Achilles heel, end quote, Plekhanov claims that this philosophy has, at any rate, quote, the unquestionable merit of not containing even a grain of eclecticism, end quote. And it was precisely Hegel's philosophy which first posed the decisive problem of a science of society, the problem at the source or unity which gives rise to the various interactive motives. Quote, we must agree with Hegel that both customs and political constitutions of a people arise from one common source. Aus einer einzigen gemeinsamen Quelle. The Q's sometimes pronounced F's in German. I don't know. What this source is, however, is revealed to us by the modern materialistic conception of history, end quote. In other words, the unitary source of everything is not the Volksgeist, but the economy. Although they agree about the need to go back from the interactions to the original source, Hegel and Marxism disagree in identifying this source in the same way that materialism and idealism part ways. After these considerations and others which we need not bother to summarize, Plekhanov concludes by reiterating what Plekhanov has already said and by locating this aspect of Hegel within a broader evaluation of his whole philosophy. The dialectic is seen as the, quote, essential scientific instrument, end quote, which Marxism has inherited from Hegel and from German idealism. Thanks to Marx, materialist philosophy has risen to a, quote, harmonious and logical, end quote, conception of the world, which has been able to correct and overcome the naivete of 18th century materialism in the historical domain. On the other hand, Marx has chased idealism from its last refuge. Quote, like Hegel, Marx has seen in the history of humanity a process subject to laws which are independent of human arbitrariness. Like Hegel, Marx has considered all of the phenomenon in the process of their birth and destruction. Like Hegel, finally, Marx has attempted to move from the interactions in the various aspects of public life to the common source from which they all arise. As a materialist, however, Marx has not identified this original source in spirit, but in the very economic evolution, end quote. There was a time, writes Plekhanov, when Hegel had against him all of the so-called innovators. Quote, what kept them away from his philosophy was his petty bourgeois attitude towards the Prussian reality of his times. But Hegel's adversaries were very much mistaken. The reactionary shell hid from their eyes the revolutionary kernel of the system. Yet their dislike for the great thinker was a result of generous motives deserving respect, end quote. But today, adds Plekhanov, all of Hegel's detractors are bourgeois. They condemn him precisely because of the innovative spirit of his philosophy. Hegel today is contraposed to Kant. Hegelian monism is faced with Kantian dualism. The ideal on our side, the real on the other. Precisely the dualism Hegel considered throughout as the worst possible insult to human reason. Actually, The Hegelian formula according to which, quote, the rational is real and the real is rational, end quote, has generated conservative misunderstanding not only in Germany but also in Russia, solely because there has been a misunderstanding about the meaning Hegel gave the words rational, vernünftig, and real, wirklich. In fact, when applied to history, this formula expresses the irrepressible conviction that nothing rational could ever remain restricted to, quote, the world beyond, end quote, and that the rational must pass into the real, thus penetrating and transforming it. What is most striking in Plekhanov's article, even more than in Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, is the heterogeneity of interpretive and contradictory motives which make up the representation of Hegel's thought from the viewpoint of, quote, dialectical materialism. In the concluding pages of his essay dealing with the Hegelian identity of the real and the rational, Plekhanov seems to interpret this formula as containing a revolutionary program to be implemented rather than an affirmation and sanctification of the existing state of affairs. In this sense, the Hegelian identity does not mean that what exists is adequate to reason, but the opposite. The Hegelian identity of the real and the rational means that the rational must be realized, that all which is, but which does not correspond to reason, seems to be but actually is not, and that, therefore, it must be subverted and overcome in order to make room for a new reality. As is well known, this is the interpretation of Hegel's thought which was popular around 1840 with the left Hegelians of Berlin's Doctors' Club. I believe Marx caught the tail end of the Doctors' Club. I'm not sure about that, so don't quote me on that. Plekhanov reiterates and explicates it only a year later in his, quote, preface to the Russian translation of Engels' work on Feuerbach. On this occasion, commenting on Engels' words according to which the poet Heinrich Heine had for a certain period been the only one able to understand the revolutionary essence of Hegelian dialectic, Plekhanov quotes one of Heine's passages, also quoted in Lukács der Junge Hegel, or the Young Hegel, in which Heine, describing an imaginary discussion with Hegel, indicates the, quote, correct, end quote, way to understand the claim about the identity of the real and the rational, quote, once I was dissatisfied with the phrase, quote, the real is rational, end quote. Writes Heine. Quote, he, Hegel, smiled in a strange way and observed that it could also mean that, quote, the rational must necessarily be, end quote, end quote. Heinrich Heine, the German poet. I believe Jewish German poet, as a matter of fact. We need not examine the soundness of this interpretation. What is relevant is that once accepted, it entails an understanding of Hegelian reason as simply subjective raison, the reason of the empirical individual rather than the transcendental logos. Thus it ends up, along with the left Hegelians and especially Bruno Bauer, with a subjective idealist reading of Hegel. Reason is the ego, the masses, etc. Consequently, the need to realize reason's passing into reality, becomes more or less a form of voluntaristic subjectivism in which, since what men consider, quote, true, quote, just, and, quote, good must be realized, the world appears as the realization and objectification of the very subjective ideal. Yet it is difficult to deny that at the very moment Plekhanov accepts this interpretation of Hegel's thought, Plekhanov develops an antithetical one, whereby Hegel's historical subject appears rightly as, quote, absolute spirit, quote, universal spirit, etc. What is relevant is that when Plekhanov criticizes his Hegelian conception of the historical subject, Plekhanov does so from presuppositions radically different from the, quote, subjectivism of the left Hegelians. Here, in fact, criticizing Hegel for having reduced the various interactive factors to the Volksgeist, Plekhanov clearly accepts the need to move from interactions to a, quote, third, or, quote, higher principle, which, although he calls it the, quote, economy, rather than spirit, nonetheless remains impersonal and objectivistic in nature, as much as more than Hegel's Volksgeist. The result of this double line of interpretation, which is typical not only of Plekhanov but of all, quote, dialectical materialism, is a fundamentally contradictory account in which the human subjective element or thought appears either as everything or as nothing, i.e., as the lever and the essential support of the revolutionary historical process, when the realization of Hegelian reason is understood as the realization of the subjective human ideal, and as an inherent reflex, when the true historical subject is the objective process, the necessity of economic evolution. In other words, Plekhanov alternates in his analysis between two interpretations of Hegel's thought without realizing that those two interpretations of Hegel's thought are intrinsically incompatible. The first interpretation of Hegel's thought, in accordance with the Hegelian left, emphasizes the elements of subjective idealism and political radicalism. The second interpretation of Hegel's thought is deterministic in character and presents the historical process as dominated by necessary and objective laws. In the first case, the defect of Hegel's philosophy is identified in the contradiction between the, quote, method and the, quote, system, i.e., between the revolutionary principles of Hegel's thought and the conservative conclusions Hegel draws from those principles, along with the, quote, compromise with the Prussian state. What follows is an application of the Hegelian method so as to allow the full realization of its revolutionary principles. Here Plekhanov quotes both Heine, who, quote, did not belong to that group of short-sighted spirits who were afraid of the implicit conclusions of Hegel's philosophy, end quote, but were able to catch, quote, its revolutionary meaning, end quote, and Herzen, for whom the Hegelian dialectic was, quote, the algebra of revolution. In the second case, Hegel's merit appears to be his having considered history as an objective process determined by laws, independent of human arbitrariness, and his limitation was only to have considered the absolute spirit instead of the economic structure as the subject of this process. Here the argument is turned around in the sense that thought or reason, instead of being the ideal to be realized, and therefore the demiurge of everything, appears as the mere reflex and passive recognition of a necessary objective process, the owl of Minerva that flies at dusk. Thus Plekhanov could write that since action is always reflected in thought and the course of things is not determined by the course of ideas, but vice versa, the contingency of free will and human judgment must yield to the, quote, necessity and regularity of objective laws. This has been The Marxism of the Second International by Lucio Colletti. Thanks for listening.